A quick tour on popular online video sharing platforms may convince you that ancient Egyptian builders were either completely useless and had to rely on alien help, or they were incredibly advanced and used power tools and lasers because Atlantis, Tom Cruise, and ice road truckers. These hypotheses are a fairly recent trend, seemingly born out of a modern mindset of people who both don't know what they're talking about and cannot comprehend how stuff could be built without the aid of sophisticated technology that they tend to also not really understand, and seemingly suffering from a false sense of superiority over our past human selves, which, to be fair, that one is an almost universal idea despite it being objectively untrue. Our millennia past ancestors were just as smart as we are, and in some ways far more capable of getting things done with a whole lot less. But going back to making the pyramids, if we look at the writings from people who lived closer in time when the periods were actually built, we find no such sense of mystery. To them, building huge monuments was impressive, sure, but did not spark wild speculation. Take Greek historian Herodotus, for example, writing in the 5th century BC. According to his Egyptian guides, the Great Pyramid at Giza was built by 100,000 men employed for 3 months a year over a period of 20 years. His colleague Diodorus Siculus, active in the 1st century BC, recounted that the construction was undertaken with the help of ramps of earth, since at that time cranes had not yet been invented. As we'll see later, further studies by Egyptologists have partially corrected the accounts of these titans of ancient history. Nonetheless, they seem to have gotten the basics right. Building a pyramid was a huge, daunting endeavor, sure, but one that could be achieved by employing resources which the pharaohs had access to, not too dissimilar to modern-day marvels like humanity going from horse-drawn carriages to walking on the moon in only a little over a half century. An immutable fact of humaning, when humans throw practically unlimited funds and large amounts of labor and expertise at a problem, we are extremely good at doing the formerly impossible. And countless examples throughout history prove this fact, which kind of makes it a shame we don't do just that at more problems we humans have today, from tuberculosis to cancer to a sequel to one of the greatest sci-fi films of all time in Galaxy Quest. Let's make it happen no matter the monetary cost. The most important things humans could ever create, Galaxy Quest 2, The Search for Grabthar's Hammer. But in a similar vein, the pharaoh's formula for building the pyramids was loads of time, plenty of cash, building techniques which were state-of-the-art at the time, and tens of thousands of skilled laborers. Yes, skilled laborers, not slaves. Time, money, and skilled labor were the founding blocks for other ancient construction projects, which Diodorus and Herodotus might have experienced directly, such as great temples, amphitheaters, roads, aqueducts, and public baths. Many of which, by the way, were architectural and engineering projects arguably significantly more sophisticated than the pyramids, and yet no one calls down aliens from the sky as being behind those projects, or at least not yet. Never underestimate what the History Channel is capable of. Just before we get back into the nitty-gritty of how specifically the pyramids were built and how we know it, speaking of a team of people building something great, keeping our Insomnia Squad production team here working 23.5 hours a day can be quite draining and takes a lot of focus and arm strength when working the whip. And while I can definitely force focus in the basement dwellers while they peck away at their keyboards, nobody is there to force focus with me, so I need a better way to regulate my energy. That's where today's sponsor Magic Mind comes in, who, note, just launched 2 new versions of their classic formula, Free and Max, the latter the world's first time-release caffeine energy drink. Magic Mind first reached out to us over a year ago now, and while we almost universally reject supplement sponsors, not because some aren't great, but because the industry is so unregulated and it takes a lot of effort to sort the good companies from the bad, in this case, after doing a deep dive into them and trying for ourselves after, we were satisfied. In a nutshell, unlike a lot of brands in this space, Magic Mind is third-party tested and sources their ingredients from some of the most reputable suppliers in the world, so you can be sure what's on the label is exactly what's in the product and nothing else. My wife and I have been regularly taking it since, most of which we paid for ourselves, and here we are. Going back to their 3 formulations, as for their latest in Free, this is my new personal favorite, as for various reasons, I strongly prefer everything caffeine-free, and their Free formulation indeed contains no sugar or caffeine, so you can take it any time of day you need a boost via their core natural ingredients. In all, the compilation meant to promote better focus, reduction in anxiety, and help with alertness and productivity, all without the caffeine. The original formula, which my wife and I had previously been taking variously for about a year now, is essentially the same but with a small dose of caffeine, akin to what you'd find in a cup of black tea or soda for an additional little boost. Then for those who like to go big or go home, like said wife who prefers her bloodstream to be at least 50% caffeine, but perhaps want a good alternative to a large cup of coffee, Magic Mind's new Max is the go-to here with 165 milligrams of caffeine. But unlike coffee, it's time-released, so it doesn't hit you all at once, giving you a smoother, longer-lasting boost in energy level and focus. Max also contains a boosted blend of the rest of the natural ingredients for a little something extra there as well. So if you too are looking for help with some extra energy, Magic Mind is offering viewers of this channel their biggest discount yet at 60% off a subscription using their QR code on the screen or link below. Note they also offer a 100% guarantee, no questions asked. So if you find it's not your cup of tea, you're not out anything. This sale's not going to be around forever, so take advantage of it while it lasts. Now let's get back to correcting everything you learned on the so-called History Channel on how the pyramids were made. Now, those who doubt the prowess of ancient builders still sometimes note how it could be that something as magnificent as the Great Pyramid of Giza might have sprung apparently from nowhere. How and why did the Egyptians come to the concept of a huge pyramid monument, and how could they get it so right off the bat considering the project started more than 4,500 years ago? Well, the truth is, they didn't come out of nowhere, and proto-pyramids abounded. It turns out our friends living along the Nile had been tinkering with other, simpler building designs for centuries before honing their craft into those magnificent structures. To begin with, until the 28th century BC, Egyptian kings were usually buried in mastabas, rectangular or bench-shaped mounds built of mud bricks or stones. They had sloped sides and a flat roof. Most were about 10 meters high and could have a surface area of up to 1,500 meters. Their archaeological value today is immense, of course, but compared to what was to come, they were rather unimpressive from an architectural standpoint. And then came Imhotep, chancellor and lead architect to Djoser, first king of the Third Dynasty, who ruled from 2667 to 2648 BC, with Imhotep also a man who really didn't like Brendan Fraser for some reason. Clearly, a run-of-the-mill mastaba would not do for Djoser's funerary monument. Thus, Imhotep conceived his step pyramid by stacking 6 mastabas, each smaller than the one below, to reach a height of 62 meters. This method ensured that Djoser's tomb could be easily seen from beyond the high walls of the Saqqara complex near Memphis on the west bank of the Nile. It was indeed a burial site fit for a king, and Imhotep would be revered as the first pyramid builder for a millennia to come. But the design could and would still be improved. The next iteration came courtesy of King Sneferu, founder of the 4th Dynasty, around 2600 BC. He had an 8-step pyramid built at Meidum, which was later covered in limestone casing, intended to smooth its sides and give it appearance of a true non-stepped pyramid. This building gradually eroded and collapsed over time so that only its core survived. Perhaps Sneferu's builders hadn't quite nailed the casing technique yet. The king had 2 more goes at erecting a pointy-shaped funerary buildings, both in nearby Dashur. The first attempt is known as the Bent Pyramid. As the name suggests, something did not go as straight as planned. From the ground up, the sides have an inclination of over 51 degrees, but about halfway they rise much less steeply at about 43 degrees. Sneferu, however, taught us a great life lesson. Remember kids, failures are just learning opportunities. Every single human who ever was bad at everything at one point except crying and sucking on their mama's boobs. From there, we fail and fail and fail at everything until we don't. In short, if you're ever going to be good at something, you first have to be willing to be bad. From there, as long as you have grit, determination, a clear vision, mountains of cash, and thousands of laborers willing to toil for your eternal glory under the African sun, well, my friends, nothing can stop you. Thus, the so-called Red Pyramid sprung up. Or rather, it was painstakingly built layer by layer over a period of 10 years. This is a classic example of a true Egyptian pyramid. It is not stepped, it is not bent, and it is massive, standing at 105 meters or 344 feet high. This progress shows how the path to figuring out how to erect one of these monuments was not an easy one, and several iterations were needed before the Egyptian civilization could deliver one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Great Pyramid at Giza. No aliens required, just improving techniques over time until they figured it out. This marvel, the largest of all pyramids, was initiated around 2580 BC by King Khufu, son of Sneferu. Its base covers an area of 5.2 hectares, that's 13 acres or almost 10 American football fields. Its sides rise at an angle of 51 degrees, reaching a height of 137 meters or 450 feet. Khufu's monument is part of a complex which includes 2 additional main pyramids built by his successors, Khafre and Menkaure, 6 small pyramids dedicated to their wives, sisters, and daughters, as well as the famous Sphinx. For the sake of this overview, we'll focus on the techniques used to erect the 3 larger pyramids, all of which were completed in the 26th century BC during the 4th dynasty. To begin with, the purpose of these and other pyramids was to serve as funerary monuments for the absolute rulers of ancient Egypt. They had to stand out, to be seen, and to be solid enough to resist the tear and wear of centuries until their occupants returned from the dead. And the pyramidal shape fulfills this brief splendidly, or more precisely, given the building techniques used more than 4,000 years ago, it was the shape that could best deliver on the requirements of the height and solidity. The builders of the Giza complex may have even taken into account the risk of earthquakes, according to Sayed Hamida at the Conservation Department Faculty of Archaeology, Cairo University, and Algri Sambol at the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. In their January 2020 paper, Sustainability Problems of the Giza Pyramids, they noted that the maximum static stress under the Greater Pyramids is about 3,500 kilopascals, yet this huge stress value did not entail any observed or likely foundation failure. According to the authors, this shows that the builders had taken into consideration the likelihood of seismic loading, founding of the monuments for the most part on solid rock, and good quality of construction of the foundation favors their good anti-seismic behavior. It is likely that anti-seismic measures had been part of the planning process. Of course, with regards to this and many other things, the truth is there are no surviving plans for Khufu's pyramid, nor documentation of how ancient architects laid down their projects. Well, with one exception, but we'll get to that in a bit. But for now, the mastermind behind the Great Pyramids was Hemunu, who is also half-brother to Khufu. Khufu's pyramid featured elements previously observed in older monuments, such as ascending and descending passageways, niches carved into walls, and corbelled ceilings. To clarify, these are ceilings in which stone slabs progressively overlap each other as you go higher, with a capstone on top to finish off the job. But Hemunu experimented with some new features and solutions worthy of such an ambitious project. For Khufu's burial chamber, the architect introduced a flat ceiling made with granite slabs. Now, a flat ceiling may not sound like an impressive feat until you consider that said ceiling had to withstand the weight of countless tons worth of huge rocks. Herein lies the genius of the architect. He stacked 5 additional layers of granite beams above the ceiling, each separated by a relieving chamber, or void spaces, which contributed to distributing pressure away from the king's chamber and the adjacent grand gallery. Another innovation was the junction of the descending and ascending passageways. The former leads from the pyramid's entrance to the subterranean chamber, while the latter climbs toward the grand gallery and Khufu's chamber. Clearly, Hemunu was not entirely sure of how to pull this off, and thus first built a scale model in the form of 2 tunnels, dug just east of the Great Pyramid. The model was ultimately unearthed by British Egyptology legend Flinders Petrie and is the only surviving evidence of Hemunu's planning work. But even before toying with relieving chambers and ascending passages, Hemunu or any other lead pyramid builders had to lay the foundations for their masterwork. And even before that, they had to pick the right location. The ground had to be solid and level enough, and the site had to be easily reached via a supply line, preferably a natural or artificial waterway. More on this later. Next, the architect laid down the boundaries of the site, etching the lines of the pyramid's sides on the ground. The sides usually ran in parallel to the north-south and east-west axis, an alignment which ancient Egyptians achieved by tracking the movements of the sun to identify the true north. It was then time to dig the site and then lay down some solid foundations, which usually consisted of 3 layers of flat stones arranged without mortar or any form of cement. According to the already quoted Hamida and Sandbul, this approach to foundations was probably conceived to absorb the shock of earthquakes. The next task for the Egyptian builders was to level the foundation, which they could achieve with a great degree of accuracy. Khufu's pyramid, for example, is leveled to 2 centimeters or less than 1 inch. There's no absolute certainty of how such precision could be ensured, but there are 2 likely methods they used. Hemunu might have flooded the construction site with a shallow layer of water, and workers then leveled all foundational material rising above the waterline. Alternatively, Hamunu might have divided the construction area into a grid of squares, planting wooden posts where vertical and horizontal lines intersected. Laborers then stretched lines along the grid, keeping them at preset height. They then carved marks on the wooden post at the corresponding height, and finally smoothed out any foundational material which rose above said marks. Now, Hamunu and other planners clearly did not do the grunt work by themselves, but employed scores of laborers and skilled craftsmen who contributed across all stages of the pyramid's building process. Quarrymen, stonemasons, metalworkers, carpenters, as well as foremen leading teams of burly dudes in charge of moving big rocks around. To say nothing of the adjacent tradespeople who had to transport building material, cater for the workers, house them, treat their occupational mishaps, and eventually bury them if their injuries were a tad too catastrophic. As mentioned, Herodotus wrote that Khufu's pyramid had been built by a combined force of 100,000 laborers, but modern Egyptologists venture much smaller estimates. On this, estimates on the real size and nature of the workforce come courtesy of archaeologist Mark Lenner from Harvard University. Lenner and his team found evidence of not one, but two towns near Giza laid out side by side. One of them appears to have grown organically, little by little over time. The archaeologists speculate that this town was erected to house a core contingent of permanent pyramid builders, a sort of company town for them and their families. It included food stores, temples, and public buildings, which could have sustained a population between 2,000 and 5,000 laborers. The second town appeared more formal and laid out according to a rigid grid in which blocks of long galleries were separated by streets, paved in limestone, covered in mud, and fitted with a drainage system. Archaeologists found a total of 40 sprawling galleries arranged into 4 large blocks, each some 170 meters long. Barry Kemp, an expert in ancient Egyptian urbanism, found that each gallery presented the same feature of a typical Egyptian house, only on a huge scale. Moreover, the galleries were flanked by row upon row of bakeries, and the surrounding soil was littered with animal bones. Alongside these galleries, Lenner and his team found more functional buildings, such as a storehouse for grain, a fish processing plant, and a workshop to produce the copper tools used by quarrymen and stonemasons. Lenner and Kemp thus concluded that the galleries acted as a sort of dormitories or barracks, which may have housed an army of up to 25,000 seasoned laborers and tradesmen, complementing the permanent workforce living in the first town. The dormitories could have held a maximum of 2,000 people at one time, which suggests that temporary workers may have traveled to Giza from their place of residence, fulfilling shifts of 3 to 4 months before returning to their original occupation. All in all, Lenner estimates that up to 30,000 men in total may have built the Great Pyramid, a slow, methodical, constant process which may have taken approximately 23 years. But numbers and time alone do not warrant the success of a building project. What really matters is how the workforce is organized. Lenner's colleague, archaeologist Zahi Hawass, surveyed a cemetery dedicated to permanent laborers and their foremen, unearthing inscriptions revealing how they were organized. The overall workforce was divided into crews of no more than 2,000 people, and each crew was further split into gangs of 1,000, identified by monikers such as the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. Then the gangs were divided into files, each numbering 200 men, and each file included 10 divisions of 20 laborers, and each division, under its own project leader, would take charge of a well-defined task. This quasi-military coordination ensured that directions from the chief architect would be effectively cascaded down to the individual project leaders so that each division completed their allocated task without stepping onto each other's feet. Of course, even when your foreman knows what he's doing, lifting giant blocks of limestone under the Egyptian sun does not exactly sound like a pleasurable task. Thus, it is fair to wonder, were these builders coerced in any way? Were they slaves? Egypt during the 4th dynasty definitely did rely on slave labor, but it appears that pyramid builders were free men. Specifically, Lenner's discoveries at Giza have highlighted how the workforce enjoyed good living conditions and were served with a rich, mouth-watering diet far above what slaves would have been given. Also amongst the ruins of the workers' city, Lenner and his team found the remains of the oldest bakery ever found in Egypt. Harvard University paleobotanist Wilma Wetterstrom analyzed plant remains at the site, determining that the Egyptian bakers used barley and emmer wheat flour as ingredients. These culinary discoveries were complemented by faunal analyst Richard Redding at University of Michigan. Within the site, he analyzed thousands of animal bones belonging to ducks, pigs, sheep, goats, and cattle. Apparently, the cattle bones recovered suggested that prime cuts of beef were being prepared and served to the builders. What is more noteworthy about this is that the plain of Giza even 4,000 years ago was probably ill-suited to cattle grazing. Therefore, the bovines were probably raised further up north, in more fertile regions of the Nile Delta, before being transported to Giza. Evidence also suggests that workers received a steady daily salary of 10 loaves of bread and 1 jug of beer. And as for their supervisors, they seem to have been compensated with hundreds of loaves and tens of jugs of fine Egyptian brew. However, as these goods are perishable, Leonard Hawass speculated that these rates may have been only indicative. It may be that builders received the equivalent of loaves and beer, paid in the form of other goods or credits. Alternatively, builders and tradesmen may have performed their duties as a part of their bak. This was a type of service owed by all Egyptian subjects to people who stood above them in the social hierarchy. This was a temporary duty, and even the highest civil servants owed bak to their higher-ups. That's why even if bak was not remunerated, it was far from being a form of serfdom or slavery. The discoveries of Leonard Hawass and other experts have clarified one of the many mysterious aspects behind pyramid building. They were built over long periods of time by thousands of skilled, burly men fed with a high-protein diet that would leave a bodybuilder drooling with envy. But muscles alone do not make huge buildings, and these guys needed the right material and in huge quantities. The most visible building components of the pyramids were gigantic limestone blocks, some weighing up to 15 tons. The builders obviously used the heavier blocks in the lower layers to provide stability, reserving the lighter ones, weighing some 1.3 tons, for the upper sections. Working only with massive cubes of limestone is impractical, however, and thus builders employed them only for the outer layers of each pyramid. The main core was built with small bricks made of baked mud, interspersed with granite and basalt slabs, used mainly for the inner galleries. Everything from here was firmly held together by layer upon layer of a special mortar concocted according to a very effective recipe: gypsum crystals, fragments of calcite and dolomite, quartz grains, and everything cemented by finely grained gypsum, anhydrite, calcite, and iron oxides. Producing such mortar must have been an industry in itself, considering how much of this stuff was required. In the case of the Great Pyramid, builders employed some 500,000 tons of ancient cement. On top of all the materials mentioned thus far, builders also laid an outer cladding, today only partially visible, which provided a smooth, glistening final appearance to the assembled pyramids. The composition of this casing varied from pyramid to pyramid. In the case of Khufu's, it was made entirely of calcite, whereas for Menkare's monument, craftsmen worked out a complex outer layer made with potash feldspar, quartz, and zircon, among many other minerals. Very sensibly, most of the material we listed was sourced locally. The limestone blocks used for Khufu's Great Pyramid, for example, came from a quarry situated just 500 meters or 547 yards south of the monument. Now, quarrying, cutting, and polishing such blocks was definitely a daunting endeavor without modern tools, but ancient Egyptians managed just as well without such niceties, relying only on patience, skill, hard work, and ingenuity. As for how they did it, this conundrum was addressed by analytical chemist and archaeologist Alfred Lucas in the 1920s, when the concept that Egyptians had access to long-lost advanced technology was plain ludicrous. Through his research and practical experiments, Lucas concluded that ancient quarrymen used an array of wooden, stone, and bronze tools to fracture limestone rock into large sections. They were then shaped, cut, and polished by using bronze saws, chisels, and drills in conjunction with an abrasive mixture, rich in corundum, a mineral composed of aluminum oxide. Builders used similar cutting and carving techniques to quarry other material aside from limestone, which, by the way, required an extra dose of blood, sweat, and tears, as it had to be transported from further afield. The minerals used for the casing, for example, were picked up at the Makadam Plateau, a 5-hour march to the east of Giza, which was still just a walk in the oasis compared to the slabs used in the inner chambers. Basalt came from the Fayum Depression, almost 100 kilometers or 62 miles southwest of Giza. Alabaster had to be sourced from Luxor, some 630 kilometers or 391 miles south, and the granite slabs likely came from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers or almost 500 miles up the Nile. This problem with distance raises the next question: how did laborers transport tons and tons of rock over such long distances? So let's start with a relatively easy task, i.e. hauling limestone blocks from the quarry situated a half kilometer away from Giza. There is no definitive answer, but we have two very likely, very practical candidates. Workers may have used large wooden wedges, each shaped like the quarter of a circle. These contraptions were attached to the corners of each limestone block, essentially rounding its edges. This way, a team of 8 men could easily roll the block around as you would do with a large barrel or keg. But the more popular theory is that the blocks may have been simply loaded on top of wooden sleds and then dragged with ropes. Japanese construction company Obayashi Corporation conducted an experiment demonstrating that just 18 men could use this technique to easily drag a 2.5-ton block at a speed of 18 minutes per mile. This task could have been made easier by employing a large squad and by pouring water or milk on the sand to act as a lubricant. Now, sleds, ropes, and muscles certainly work fine for short distances, but how about hauling these slabs of granite and other heavy rocks from hundreds of kilometers away? In that case, Egyptians could rely on their best non-human friend, the River Nile. All of the locations from which materials were sourced from Fayum to Aswan are conveniently located near the shores of the Nile, making it relatively easy to load even heavy rocks onto the barge or any other shallow draft boat and then sail downriver. Of course, if you look at the current map of Egypt, you probably realize that the Giza Plateau is about 9 kilometers or 5.6 miles west from the nearest branch of the Nile, which is quite the distance to be dragging massive loads. But pyramid builders had not only enviable quads and guns, but they had even more enviable brains. And if they could spare themselves some extra sweat, they would. Rather than walking the last leg of the journey, they more likely exploited a pre-existing arm of the Nile, now defunct, which stretched further west towards Giza. Quoting from a 2022 paper by geoarchaeologist Dr. Haider Sheisha at Aix-Marseille University, new paleoecological analysis have helped to reconstruct an 8,000-year fluvial history of the Nile in this area, showing that the former waterscapes and higher river levels around 4,500 years ago facilitated the construction of the Giza Pyramid complex. So, according to the good doctor, the Giza builders exploited higher water levels to dig a network of canals and basins, culminating in a port complex at the very foot of the Giza Plateau. This artificial harbor was likely the setting of a lively trade consisting mainly of small vessels which transported lighter materials, supplies, and workers. During the flood season, in contrast, from August to October, the water levels in the port complex rose up to 7 meters or 23 feet, allowing for the docking of larger cargo ships. More recent studies indicate that the Nile was the backbone of the construction of the pyramids across all of Egypt, not just at Giza. In May of 2024, geomorphologist Dr. Emin Ghanem and her team at University of North Carolina, Wilmington announced the discovery of a lost branch of the Nile, now dry and covered by sand and farmland. By using radar satellite imagery, historical maps, and sediment coring, Dr. Ghanem and team were able to trace the path of this lost branch, which they named Aramat after the Arabic word for pyramid. The Aramat branch extended for some 64 kilometers or 39 miles, flowing from south to north, roughly in parallel to the main course of the Nile. By looking at a map of the Aramat, it is apparent how it bordered several pyramid sites from Lisht down south and then north to Dashur, Saqqara, Abusir, and eventually Giza. All in all, the lost branch may have contributed to the construction of 31 pyramids before drought and sandstorms caused its disappearance. So, once all the material was sourced, it was time to put it all together, which raises the next big question: how could blocks weighing at least 1.3 tons be hoisted up a structure taller than 100 meters? Once again, we can find some early answers from ancient historians. Diodorus Siculus wrote that the construction was undertaken with the help of ramps of earth. Egyptologists generally accept this concept, and archaeological evidence has proved that ramps of earth, gravel, and bricks were in fact used by Egyptians at several construction sites. One of the best examples comes from the Temple of Karnak, where a mud brick ramp still stands. Other inclined walkways were found next to an early unfinished step pyramid at Abydos, likely commissioned by Pharaoh Hunu, Khufu's grandfather. And in 2018, a joint team from the French Institute for Oriental Archaeology and the University of Liverpool uncovered the remains of a ramp at the Hatnam Alabaster Quarry, fitted with post holes all the way up the structure. The use of wooden posts suggests that workers may have tied ropes around them and then pulled down said ropes to haul alabaster slabs up the ramp. So, all evidence seems to be that the builders probably first loaded limestone blocks, slabs, or other materials onto sleds, then these sleds were pulled up the ramps by using the ropes tied around the posts. Other teams of workers may have helped by pulling directly at the sleds while pouring water or milk to lubricate the surface of the ramp. The ramps unearthed by scholars, however, do not clarify what the ramps employed at the Giza site exactly looked like. Egyptologist Flinders Petrie, writing in the early 1880s, speculated that workers employed a single, long, and straight ramp climbing to the top of the pyramid, which then turned in a zigzag shape near the summit. However, his German colleague Uwe Halscher, writing in 1912, found it more likely that the ramps zigzagged all the way from the base to the top. Another German archaeologist, Dieter Arnold, proposed yet again a straight ramp, but one that would cut through the middle of the pyramid itself. As for our good friends Leonard and Hawass, they placed their bets on a long, winding, spiraling ramp twisting around the exterior of the monument. In 2005, French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin proposed an alternative to the spiral concept. In his view, the ramp may have been placed inside the pyramid. If that were the case, a ramp could still be present inside the Great Pyramid itself. Indeed, one study using a technique called microgravimetry revealed CG images consistent with an internal ramp. However, a later study conducted by the Scan Pyramid mission found no evidence of the structure, thus seemingly disproving Houdin's theory. Whatever their configuration, ramps still stand as the most likely way they got the blocks up there. But Leonard Hawass raised an important conundrum. As one approaches the apex of the pyramid, the sides of the geometrical shape get narrower and narrower. Towards the top, builders will have run out of room to lay out their ramps, which implies that they needed to employ more sophisticated techniques to hoist their blocks. According to the two scholars, it is very possible that levering was the only means to raise the blocks at the highest courses near the apex, once the builders had brought them as high as they could on the ramps. And note on this, the use of levers, or more complex machines, had been described as early as 425 BC by good old Herodotus. They raised the remaining stones with machines made of short pieces of timber, raising them first from the ground to the first stage of the steps, and when the stone got up to this, it was placed upon another machine standing on the first stage, and so from this it was drawn to the second upon another machine. While the description is not entirely clear, this could be interpreted as Egyptians using a seesaw-like machine made of wooden beams on which they place counterweights to raise the blocks. According to researchers such as Somers Clark, author of Ancient Egyptian Construction and Architecture, ramps and seesaw contraptions were complemented by the ample use of scaffolding. The area of the Nile Delta was, and still is, very fertile, which allowed Khufu's subjects to grow and exploit some sturdy timber from date palms, acacias, sycamore, and other trees, which were routinely used to build big boats or big, solid temple doors. Besides this, Khufu's dad Sneferu had established trade routes with modern-day Lebanon, contributing to the import of cedar wood, even better suited for scaffolding purposes. Also in this case, scholars are not entirely aligned on how and why scaffolding may have been used. According to engineer James Frederick Edwards in his paper, Building the Great Pyramid, Probable Construction Methods Employed at Giza, scaffolds were used by the most skilled masons at the very end of the construction process. Perched atop the wooden beam and platforms, these laborers applied the final gleaming layers of white limestone cladding. And it's at this point we like to think those indefatigable builders enjoyed some barbecued beef and a cool beer atop their scaffolds while enjoying the sight of the last rays of the setting sun bouncing off the apex of the perfectly finished pyramid, while similarly reflecting off the silver flying saucers flitting away to the stars in the distance, with said saucers' occupants likewise pleased with what they'd helped the humans accomplish in the pyramids. On that note, while of course there is still some mystery as to exactly how every facet of the pyramid construction was accomplished, what we have, however, is a collection of very realistic theories supported by archaeological findings and field experiments which attest that Egyptian builders had at their disposal a vast array of resources, skills, tools, and techniques to erect some veritable wonders of the ancient world. No ancient aliens required, and indeed, had there been, we'd have hoped for structures a bit more advanced from what came before. And speaking of what came before, contrary to popular belief, this vast engineering knowledge did not materialize overnight. Egyptian architects and builders developed their methods over easily perceivable centuries of painstaking work by making the most of the resources they had at their disposal, such as local quarries or now dried up branches of the Nile. Along the way, these indomitable constructors of marvels played around with some pretty basic designs and stumbled upon some embarrassing fails, but they were able to learn from these experiences and hone their increasingly ambitious techniques, propelling the development of their society along the way. To paraphrase Mark Leonard, the development of such techniques and the marshaling of enormous resources required by the pyramids did not just impact the building trade, but contributed to shaping Egyptian civilization itself.